Well, it's 5:01 Eastern Time, so we're officially starting. So we have enough time to benefit from the presence of Richard here. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sil Curiati, your host. I happen to be a storyteller with a passion for building bridges that connect people to jobs, brands to consumer, and even soulmates. I love that part too. Today, I'm hosting the fourth of the meetup series, What's Your Story? My goal is to bring inspiring guests to share their stories with you. I only invite people who truly inspire me, hoping that they will inspire you too. This meeting is being recorded already, but this should not hold you back. Hopefully, you're going to participate and ask questions. That's what we want. For now, I just kindly ask you to mute your mic and please open your camera. It's always nicer to see some faces when we're having conversations, and it's going to be more exciting for Richard to get your feedback while he speaks. He's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions. You'll be able to ask your questions directly or send them to me over DM so I can ask them on your behalf if you prefer. My company story works with individuals and corporations on several fronts, storytelling being one of them. If we are not connected yet, please look me up on LinkedIn and let's chat sometime. I believe we are much more powerful when we allow our competing interests to blend together. Our stories are much more interesting, authentic, and compelling when we make sense of the fragmentation and show up as a whole. I also believe that the stories we tell ourselves have the power to shape up our lives. So to talk about his wonderful story of transformation, it's my honor to introduce Richard Vevers. Welcome you, Richard, and please tell us in a few words, in a minute or so, what is your story?
Well, thank you, Sil. It is great to be able to share this story. And my story is, I started life in London and had a really normal life up until the age of 30, sort of working in advertising until I had a very bad meeting one day. And that's when life changed. I walked out and decided to become an underwater photographer, not having ever taken an underwater shot in my life before. And it took me on this really unplanned, unexpected, hugely adventurous journey that led me finally to being sort of a leading spokesperson for coral reef conservation. And I still feel it's just start of the journey now.
I love that. We've all been there. Bad meetings in advertising, it's something that no one gets rid of. So I'm happy that you did. Well, we'd love to hear all about your story. I'm going to only ask you one more question and maybe you just can go and start. I was curious as I was reading your bio and all the conversations that we had. You talk about the conservation folks, the ocean conservation programs. Have you always been known by these folks and the conservation teams, or how did you build your reputation in a completely different world? Like coming from advertising, people in advertising are not taking as seriously as we think overall. They think we're all a bit crazy. So I'd love to hear your reputation story. How did you build it in such a different area? And then please talk more about yourself.
Well, I think my sort of, I never thought of myself as an ocean conservationist. I never dreamed of being an ocean conservationist. I was, really sort of business minded. And I think, what I brought in was new thinking into this space. And it was the collaborations with the likes of Google early on that built a reputation because it wasn't what was normally done in ocean conservation. So I think I got over those early barriers of being accepted by doing something completely different. And hopefully you can see my screen there.
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So, as I mentioned, this bad meeting was really about toilet tissue, 4-ply versus 3-ply, and the heated debates that go around that. And I realized this was the moment in my career that I felt I might be able to do something more with my life. So I walked out and decided to become an underwater photographer, as I mentioned, but I hadn't got any experience as an underwater photographer. I was a diver, but had never taken an underwater picture. And so I had to learn very quickly. And And I felt I had reasonable success early on. I was living in Bondi Beach, great access to the ocean, and this was a shot I took off Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia, of weedy sea dragons. And I love being an underwater photographer, but it was very difficult to make any money from it. You find most of the other underwater photographers are independently wealthy. And I soon found myself working with conservation organizations, bringing my old advertising skills and while doing sort of photography at the same time. And it was this sort of learning was I suddenly realized there was so much going on in the ocean that I wasn't aware of, even as a passionate diver. So many issues. And I felt my skills could be better used, not necessarily just as an underwater photographer, but working in ocean conservation, but really about raising awareness. So using communication to raise awareness. So I set up the Ocean Agency back in 2010 with the idea of acting like an agency for the ocean. So representing ocean conservation and ocean science by getting support for their product, essentially, and generating interest. And the idea was to bring in creative thinking, so new insights, creative ideas, and then collaborations that could accelerate ocean conservation. Now, the first project idea that we came up with was it turned out to be the Seaview survey. And we had great collaborators for this one, but Google was the most famous. The idea here was that most people don't get in the water, don't get in the ocean. 99.9% of people don't dive. So we wanted a way to allow people to explore the oceans, to get engaged with the oceans. And this was the moment that everyone was interested in Google exploring kind of up Mount Everest and all around the world, but they weren't doing anything in the ocean. So I decided to invent a camera that could take the equivalent of the underwater Street View camera for going underwater. It was a military grade scooter. And we designed a 360 camera to go on the front. And I thought this was going to be the most epic adventure ever, going to reveal dive sites all over the world. And it was initially. But what we made sure we did early on was design the camera to have maximum media appeal. Made sure it would have, be able to make a double page spread in Time magazine, so that we could really raise awareness about the ocean and get people interested in the imagery that we were creating. But it's at this point that the journey often sort of goes off on weird angles. I got in a conversation with an ocean scientist who said that there wasn't a global survey of coral reefs, and we soon realized that our camera could do that. There wasn't any funding model for this. So we thought, well, we could potentially get a sponsor and do that global survey. And so that's what we did. We essentially turned the Google Street View project into a global survey of coral reefs, creating the first ever global visual baseline, taking 1 million images in 28 different countries, and even developing the image recognition software to be able to analyze that imagery and making it all open source. But the key was getting imagery that would allow our sponsor to make a profit. So we made sure we photographed the scientists, told the story in a really engaging way. And we got over 10,000 media articles. And overall, the media exposure was valued at over $200 million, which gave them a 5-fold better return on investment than if they'd sponsored a football team or a standard sports team. And we were able to do amazing science with this. We discovered the deepest ever coral on the Great Barrier Reef. We wrote 26 different scientific papers and created this amazing baseline record. But it was more than just the science. We were able to do exhibitions at the Natural History Museum in London, for example. We developed an education program available to 90 million kids through Google Education. And it was as if virtual reality was made for educating about the ocean. And it allowed us to do all sorts of things like get unusual companies involved, like Accenture, really helping us with the image recognition software to analyze the imagery that we were taking. So using that business knowledge to form partnerships to greatly accelerate the ocean science, and different funding models. That then led on to the Chasing Coral project. And this was, again, talking to the scientists. They explained the threat of climate change on coral reefs. And I really wasn't aware that it was such a serious threat, when we started this project. And but we realized that, again, we had the right cameras and the right equipment and the right resources to be able to reveal what was happening. Now, traditionally, what had been happening was people like NOAA in the US had been announcing about coral bleaching events, but they'd been using photography like this. It was a picture that very few people understood what was happening here, and it wasn't that attractive, so it didn't make the news too often. And this was the one of the biggest global bleaching events that was happening. So, because of climate change, coral reefs are dying. And essentially they're turning white as part of that process. And what we wanted to do was to take imagery that told that, because it is one of the most spectacular sights in nature. So that's what we did. We became like the underwater storm chasers, chasing underwater heat waves. And whenever we knew one was happening, we would head out on a plane the following day. I flew into Maldives for this shot and was there for about 36 hours. Before a big hurricane hit, and we had to sort of evacuate. But it was about getting this kind of imagery that would make front page news. And we told it the story from all sorts of angles. This is fluorescing corals, where the corals have a chemical sunscreen in them, but create these incredible scenes that, Time magazine ran a story on this, calling it Nature's Most Beautiful Death. And it made front page news really around the world because we had the imagery and we told the story in a way that would attract media attention. We worked with the US government to actually give the coral bleaching event a number. We called it the third global bleaching event. There was a lot of scientific debate about what number the bleaching event was, but we said just agree on one because it will get media interest. They'll ask, what about the first two and why don't we know about it? And is it climate change related? And that's exactly what happened in the lead up to the Paris Climate Conference. And we got a lot of coverage, about $100 million worth of media coverage about coral bleaching in the lead up to the Paris Climate Conference. And it led to the film, Chasing Coral. I approached the director. I'd seen his previous work where he was documenting the loss of glaciers around the world due to climate change, and knew he could tell a fantastic story about the loss of coral reefs. And so he followed our team for 3 years until this film came out, and it won the Emmy for Outstanding Nature Documentary. He was a brilliant storyteller that knew how the power of storytelling and using people and technology to do that, to engage in a subject that doesn't normally engage. And we did all sorts of things with this project, inventing new technology once again to be able to capture time lapse of coral bleaching. And then I got to a moment where I realized I wanted to do more than just raise awareness, had to get involved in the solution because there wasn't a global plan to save coral reefs. So I came up with what was seen as a very controversial plan. I came up with this name, 50 Reefs, and said, we've only got a limited amount of money for saving coral reefs, so we can only save 50. Which 50 should it be? So it was a targeted approach. And we got scientists from around the world involved in tackling this question. And they did something very clever and unexpected. They used modern portfolio theory, the algorithm that's used for selecting stocks and shares, to create a portfolio investment for saving coral reefs. So the best 50 portfolio of coral reefs around the world where investments could happen. And this selected sites like this one is in Indonesia, these really incredible reefs which are less vulnerable to climate change, but work really beautifully together as a portfolio. And it resulted in one of the biggest ever donations for coral reef conservation. over $93 million pledged to bolster conservation efforts in those 50 reef locations. And it's led to even more investments. You know, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs is now using 50 reefs as the pivotal study for where to target action. And recently we were out for COP27 in Egypt. It just so happens that Sharm el-Sheikh, where the climate conference happened, is on one of the sites, you know, of 50 reefs. And actually the site that is arguably the least vulnerable coral reef in terms of, you know, vulnerability to climate change in the world. So we saw this as a perfect opportunity of raising awareness of the importance of that reef and potentially securing protection at the climate conference. And so we were there in November campaigning for this. We even took Ellie Goulding out there to go see the reef and then campaign on our behalf. And it resulted in the Egyptian government pledging to protect all 2,000 kilometers of their reef, the Great Fringing Reef in the Red Sea. We even gave the reef the name, the Great Fringing Reef, because if you build a brand around the reef, you can then get people more excited about protecting it and recognizing its importance. So this is sort of the activity that we've been doing for, you know, the last 10 years on coral reefs. But, you know, with the pandemic, that gave us an opportunity to sort of stop and think and wonder whether or not we should be now broadening the thinking that we've taken from sort of coral reefs.